Okay guys, on the show today we're going to be acting to kids who remember their past lives. Also, go check out
The afterlife is a topic shrouded in mystery and speculation, ultimately leaving us with very little factual data to go on. However, in countless instances, some children have claimed to remember their past life, often telling others about it in great detail. An interesting fact to note is that after these children reach the age of 5 or 6, they seem to lose all recollection of these memories, and often don't even remember telling others about them. Here are 5 of those stories. Number 5. This first story is of a guy from Scotland. He says that while he doesn't particularly remember the story himself, his mother told him about it when he was older and still firmly believes it to this day. He says, "When I was about 4, we were driving through Scotland, and I'd never been to Scotland before in my life. We stopped at this pub in a small village. I got out of the car and said, 'Oh, my favorite place,' which my parents thought was a bit weird, but just sat down and got a drink, and my dad looked around and said, 'Where are the toilets?' I apparently leapt up and took him by the hand straight to the toilets, which were actually tucked away right behind a fake wall. Apparently my parents were just a bit unsettled, but assumed I'd seen them on the way in. But that's when it got weird. I was telling my mom about how much I used to love coming here and sitting beside the fire. There actually wasn't a fire in the pub at all, so my mom laughed and asked me what fire, and I pointed to a wall and said that there used to be a fire over there. She shrugged it off, but then I carried on and went into detail. I claimed I used to live out here and came to the pub.
This is weird. I don't know if I'm going to get a copyright strike for this, but yeah, hopefully not. But see you guys another time. I pause it.
Nearly every day. I was friends with the owner, Fred. My mom went and spoke with one of the bar staff and asked if a man named Fred used to work here, to which she replied, "Oh no, sorry miss, Fred died over 10 years ago." My parents say it was one of the spookiest things. Obviously, maybe I'd seen a sign, maybe I'd noticed the toilets when I walked in, or seen a picture of an old fireplace on the wall. I don't remember. But I choose to believe that I used to be an old farmer with a local pub in Scotland. Number 4. This next story is terrifying and comes from a guy who claims to have died in his late 20s along with his girlfriend. He says, "When I was a child, preschool age, I used the..."
It's me, guys. I don't know, but it's really weird. So I'm in my sitting room. As you can see, well, you can't see, but yeah, I'm reacting this in my sitting room. It's a journey. Like, buying. It's upstairs or something like that.
Long words for stop and come back. When asked about this, I told my parents a story about it being late at night, and I stood in a long line of people on a road that curved around the hillside. I was worried about my papers. I heard a gunshot and the people in uniforms checking papers came walking down the line yelling for me. I was a late 20s male and had a female partner. I took her by the hand so we could run for it down the hill. I remember thinking I just need to make it across the river because of the dogs, and we need to go now to have some distance before the men in uniforms get too close. We ran and the men in uniforms started yelling the words I used as a child for stop and come back.
Sorry about that. Yeah. Let's react to it more.
Close. We both turned face down. I remember thinking what a pitiful attempt to try to hide in the grass. They saw us and they're right behind us, but we don't have another option. I crawled on top of her to protect her as best I could, with my back to the men in uniforms. I remember hoping they would only beat me, but I knew that wasn't going to happen. There were 2 men chasing us, one closer than the other. They were both only 20 steps behind or so, because as soon as she fell and I stopped to protect her, I heard their footsteps slow down. I closed my eyes, listened to the footsteps stop, and I heard a gunshot. Everything went white, and I woke up as a child again and thought, it'll be better this time. My parents asked around about the words I used.
Everything went white and he woke up as a child. That's weird as.
It turns out they're checked. I still have a recurring dream about the line, the running, being chased, her falling and me trying to protect her, and even being shot in the back at close range. This happens at least once a year. I always wake up with the sting of being shot between the spine and the right shoulder blade. Number 3. This next story details a woman's experience with reincarnation, just a couple years after she gave birth to a stillborn daughter. Just a warning, this story is extremely weird and maybe a bit triggering for some of you who have dealt with similar situations. It was in the early afternoon of Halloween. This is a rough time of year for me because my child is stillborn near this day. I was sitting in a chair in the den. My husband was working at the desk on the opposite side of the room. My 2.5-year-old daughter was moving around the room, not really doing anything. As always happens on this day, my thoughts turned to my stillborn daughter. Suddenly, my daughter plops a book onto my lap. Remember, she's 2 and she can't read yet. The book that she handed me was one that was given to me after the stillbirth. It was a pagan book for grieving parents. Startled at the coincidence, I just kind of stared at the book. My daughter then flipped open the book and attempted to point to a paragraph. I obeyed and read the paragraph. It was talking about how a child who dies may reincarnate back into the same family or somewhere nearby. So I wondered where my child might have reincarnated. My daughter then patted on my leg and broke an hours-long silence and said in baby talk, "I'm right here, Mommy." Number 2.
Baby talk, I don't know how you understand baby talk, but these might be fake, these might be real. You guys tell me, I don't care.
This next story details a babysitter's encounter with a child who claims to remember his time in the war. Her post states, "I babysat this child frequently when I was younger. Well, he began drawing a particular building non-stop, except it wasn't a typical 4-year-old scribbly drawings. He had drawn it in a similar fashion to an architect, on an angle and using folded paper as a makeshift ruler to make the straight lines. It was absolutely insane. He had the windows drawn perfectly in line, everything was dimensional. He would spend hours drawing this building over and over again. One day, when he was sitting in another room drawing, I walked by and noticed that he was drawing something else. It was an aerial view of the city block, except it had a couple of buildings and some other blank spaces. He had drawn maybe 40 to 50 X's on the page, in some kind of formation, others by the corner of the buildings and by trees, some were inside of the buildings. I asked him what the X's were and why some of them were inside the buildings and some were outside. He said, "The infantry is looking out the window." I said, "What was that? I didn't hear you." He sighed and said, "We were losing daylight and had to move fast to make it through. My men took the building and we were looking out the window." I asked, "Your men? What are you talking about?" He looked at me with such a pain.
World War II was a bit really sad, actually. Yeah, really sad. Just looking at this picture is weird because you can see everyone. Yeah. So let's carry on.
Expression, I'll never forget it. He pushed his drawing back and sat for a moment, staring at it, then quietly and very sadly said, "Those were my men." He excused himself from the table, and this kid was a hellion, so he never excused himself. He walked away with his head down, and I didn't push the subject. He made several more graphic drawings when he was 4 to 5, but when he reached the age of 6, it was like his ability greatly regressed. He drew more like a 6-year-old and less like a precise architect. He never mentioned infantry or his men again. No one in that family was in the military, and he would have never been exposed.
See, for some reason at the beginning of this video it said I don't remember 6, which I find weird that he's just gone and said that. Yeah, I don't know. I think these are fake for some reason. You guys can tell me if they are, but or not in the comments below. But I feel like it's fake.
Anything like that. Number 1. In this final story, a mother tells of how her young son claims to have been a pilot in a past life, but eventually made a fatal mistake. She says, "When my son was 3 years old, my husband decided to take him on an airplane tour of our small city. They booked a tour in a small 3-seater plane, pilot and my husband in the front and room for the little guy in the back. When they got out on the tarmac though, our son pushed past the pilot and climbed into the pilot seat. When my husband told him he couldn't sit there because that was for the pilot, our boy got really sad and quietly said, 'It's because I crashed it last time, isn't it?' He then started crying and shaking his head, yelling, 'All of those people died because of me.' He then climbed back down and started running back to the terminal in tears. My husband finally got him settled down by explaining that his legs were too short for his feet to reach the pedals, and it wasn't because he crashed it last time. So back they headed to the plane and got settled in. Sitting in the back, my boy asked if he could have a headset. They then gave him one and left the microphone turned off, but the pilot didn't tell him the microphone was turned off. So the little guy started doing his checks and trying to talk to the tower. Needless to say, the pilot was a little freaked out about this, but he never did ask our son about why he supposedly crashed a plane. 3 years later, we all headed to an aviation museum, and our now 6-year-old son started curators about a certain type of World War II British plane. I was a bit surprised because we didn't have any books about planes in our house, and he'd never shown any interest in them before. Lucky for my son, though, the Aviation Museum was in the process of restoring one of the very planes he was talking about, and they offered to let us have a look even though it wasn't ready for display yet. Apparently, a private collector had modernized the plane sometime in the late 1970s or so, and they were in the process of restoring it to its origin. My son started pointing out several different items in the plane that he thought weren't right, and things that had been replaced, etc. When we asked about how he knew about this, he said he had flown one of these a few times when he was big. He couldn't tell us much more except that he normally flew a different type of plane that he'd crashed because he had made a mistake. He also said that several innocent people died in the crash and that it wasn't their time to die yet. He got very sad and then said he didn't want to talk about it anymore. When we asked about it again when he was in his teens, he said he remembered the trip to the museum but didn't remember being big before. Thank you guys